Hello and welcome to E-Squared Media Network's third webcast in a series where we're talking about, today we're talking about effectively engaging our culture. In the past, we've talked about raising our families, we've talked about healing and experiencing a healing God. Today, we're going to look at the world around us, the society that we live in, and really as Christians, how are we called to effectively engage it? Not just put up with it, not keep it at arm's distance, but really make a difference and engage it, accept it with a biblical perspective. We've got two amazing guests today. First off is John Stonestreet from the Colson Center. Actually, he's coming to us from Manitou Springs, Colorado, where he's speaking at the Summit Lecture Series, which is absolutely phenomenal. If you've got young adults in your house, I thoroughly encourage you, find out how to send them to Summit Lecture Series every summer. It's an amazing experience where they hear some phenomenal speakers like John, like Sean McDowell, his authoring partner, Frank Turek. There's so many others that just offer so much to say about this world we live in. And then we've got Jeff Allen, stand-up comedian extraordinaire. He's been all around the world performing for our troops. He's been on Glenn Beck. He's been on DVDs across the country, and Jeff is just a great guy. But not only is he a comic, he's also a guy who has studied apologetics, definitely more than me. Put those two skill sets together, and he sees the world in a light that few of us do. And he's able to pick up on nuances that few of us are able to. When we talk about culture, I can't help but think of the reality that there's kind of a way that life has been over the last several generations. And maybe I'm out of context, but when I look at life and I go, when I was a boy, I still think that wasn't too long ago, but in actuality it is. Because I know when I was a boy and when my parents were kids and everything in between, we would go to Disneyland. Living in Southern California, we go to Disneyland quite a bit. And we would go on It's a Small World. And pretty much everybody knows It's a Small World. It's the same ride for 40 years, 50 years, exact same ride. Same music, same little figures dancing around, clapping their hands, singing the same song. And for more than 2 generations, people would go through the ride and see all the different countries and see all the different dolls and experience it in all the same way. My parents would watch me going through the ride as a little kid and think, wow, he looks just like I did when I was a little kid. Well, just a few years back, Disney made a subtle change, a benign change. Over the years, they would repaint it. They might add a few figures, but this time they did something a little bit different. They tucked away classic Disney characters throughout the ride. They've got Mulan flying a kite in Asia. They've got Lilo and Stitch riding a surfboard over in the Pacific Islands. In London, they've got Tinkerbell circling around Big Ben. And I watch my kids ride this ride, same ride, same music, same boat, same everything as when I was a kid and when my parents were a kid. But now it's a game of Where's Waldo for my kids. They go through it and it's an entirely different scenario. They're playing contests on who can find the Disney character fastest, and everything is just real fast right now. Let's go. Now the next one. Let's turn the corner. Wait, I just saw that one way over there. I didn't even turn that corner yet. What? It's an entirely different phenomenon. Now this is just the microcosm of It's a Small World. Translate that into our culture. We're still living in America. The same songs are still playing. The same routines, by and large, are happening day to day. But there's little changes, and we'll talk about it. There's also some very large changes that are occurring within our culture that are causing this new generation to live life and experience life in a completely different fashion than what we ever did. And that's what we're going to talk today. Let's open up right now. John from Manitou Springs. John Stonestreet, how are you doing today?
Good, thanks. Thanks for having me on today.
John, you're speaking this morning. We talked a little bit about, to your students, about a Christian worldview. Now, when I talked to a few people this week and letting them know you were going to be on our show, we're going to be talking Christian worldview, I asked several people, what does that mean to them? And by and large, I got the same answer. They said, oh, that's easy. Love God, love others. That's Christian worldview. That's how we should view the world around us, through that paradigm. And I said, well, that's a great answer. But I know you've got another paradigm in mind and another kind of set of priorities maybe. Would you explain to us what you mean by Christian worldview?
Well, no, I think that would be a good summary as long as we still mean the same thing that we should mean when it comes to what we mean by love. I mean, one of the sneaky things about ideas is that ideas often come to us come at us through the lens of kind of assumed definitions. So over the weekend, that word love showed up an awful lot, didn't it? I mean, since Friday's Supreme Court decision was given, Justice Kennedy's opinion about same-sex marriage, there was a lot of that same word, love one, love one. So they're using the same word, but does it mean the same thing? Many Christians would certainly say no. Many others would certainly say no. What we mean by Christian worldview is essentially this. First of all, we'll start with the worldview part. Everybody has one. Everybody sees the world through a set of ideological lenses. It doesn't mean we've thought about it. It just means we have. People have assumptions about life in the world, assumptions about human nature, assumptions about what happens when you die and what's the good life and who sets the rules and so on. The question isn't, do we have a worldview? The question is, what is it? What's shaping that worldview? And, I don't know if an example of this would, I was on an airplane several years ago and sat next to this lady, and she said, well, what do you do? I said, well, I work for a Christian leadership organization. And she's like, I'm an atheist. Prove me wrong. I mean, we weren't even off the ground yet. It was just kind of an immediate, shot across the bow. We had a wonderful conversation, but, we talked about God, but we also talked about truth. We talked about government. We talked about science. We talked about sexuality. And we talked about all kinds of things and realized that it wasn't just that we disagreed on God. We saw the world in completely different ways. And that's what a worldview is. Now, a Christian worldview then would be basically seeing the world in a Christian sort of way, which Jesus did sum up as love God and love people. But then we got to say, well, what is love? And what are people? Are people products of the evolutionary process? Are people means to my financial ends? Are people primarily sexual creatures who have a personal, private relationship with God? Or are people actually created in the image of God and how they serve God, both in spirit, truth, and in their body, matter? I mean, all of these things are different based on our, worldview. And just to kind of close up here, the worldview is like a pair of lenses, like a pair of prescription glasses. And that's the power of worldview. If I've got the wrong prescription in my contacts, I'm not going to see the world the right way. But the right prescription actually allows me to see the world the right way. And so two people can be in the same neighborhood and actually see reality very differently. And one is going to be closer than the other based on what reality actually is based on their worldview. So that's really the goal, is that we can actually figure out truth and know the sort of world that we live in so that we can live well in it.
And you mentioned early on the word assumptions.
Yeah.
One of the assumptions I think that we often run into is we assume, well, Joe down the street, he's a Christian. He goes to First Whatever Church down the road. And Nancy, she's a Christian. So since we're all Christ followers, we must have the same worldview. The reality, though, seems to be like there's actually, even within the church paradigm, within what is called Christianity, there seems to be several different prescriptions out there. Are you finding that to be true as well?
No, that's exactly right. And, Paul talks about the responsibility we have to the faith that's been passed on. And a lot of Christians, I think, a lot of us kind of maybe are guilty of having a secular worldview with a twist. Our categories of morality and meaning and purpose and so on are basically shaped by our culture, but we kind of decorate our personal private lives, or we decorate our weekends with Jesus. And that's not the same thing as seeing Jesus as the King of Kings, Lord of Lords. I think there's a great statement from one of the great worldview thinkers, a guy named Abraham Kuyper. And here's how he said it. He said, there's not a single square inch over the whole domain of human existence over which Jesus Christ, who is Lord of all, does not claim mine. In other words, really, a lot of people understand religious faith, particularly Christian faith, to be personal and private. And what I'd argue is that it's personal, but it's not private. I mean, if Jesus rose from the dead, that's not a personal belief. That's a belief that's actually true, and it actually changes reality. If a dead man rose from the dead and forgave us of our sins, the entire world is different. In fact, Paul says, that means that Jesus Christ became King of Kings and Lord of Lords. God exalted him above all things, and so he is the sovereign that Abraham Kuyper talks about. So I would say a Christian worldview then is every square inch of culture we realize that it's his and figure out what that means.
Now, part of that is not only did he die for my sins, he died for your sins. This is easy. We belong to the same tribe, if you will. And even I think it's easy to realize that, the homeless guy at the freeway off-ramp, He died for his sins. That is a little bit of stretch, but it's easy. When we look at people who live on the other side of culture, and I know I've heard you talk about how not only did Jesus come and die for all of our sins, but we are all made of the same image, all made of God's image. When we have that kind of worldview, that should kind of tweak things in the way that a lot of us view people on the other side of culture as well. Would you kind of dive into that for us a bit?
Well, yeah, I mean, the Christian worldview begins with a creation. I mean, what we believe about where everything came from and what we believe about human beings. And what the Scripture says is that humans are made in the image of God. In other words, we have inherent dignity. We don't have dignity because we've acquired it once we've acquired a certain set of functions, or because we have a certain skin color or a certain gender. We have value because we're members of the human families. There's an identity that's established through Christianity that's unique. I mean, it's interesting. Our founders wrote, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. But if you've ever been in a room with a whole bunch of different people, it's self-evident that we're not created equal. I mean, there's nothing outside of us. So in other words, the only way the founders could get there is and it's interesting as well, there's a somewhat recent book by an atheist philosopher named Luke Ferry. He kind of traces ideas in Western civilization. He has a whole chapter on Christianity, which is funny because he's actually grumpy about doing it. He didn't want to include a chapter about Christianity as an atheist. His atheist buddies said, they told him not to because, Christianity, that's a religion, it's not a philosophy. But he said he had to include it because it's only in Christianity that you get the idea, called it an innovation, that humans are equal in dignity. And it's so interesting because he goes on to say that it's from that idea that the world owes its entire democratic inheritance. You get democracy from that belief that humans are made in the image and likeness of God. So that's something that even atheists can recognize, that universal human rights is not grounded in atheism in a world that's dominated by a natural selection, survival of the fittest sort of way. I mean, some are going to be better than others and clearly have been. Universal human dignity is not going to be based in any sort of kind of ethnocentric sort of worldview. It's going to be based on something that we all share, that there's a universality, which again goes to that difference between Christianity being a personal private faith and being a personal faith that has public consequences. Because we believe Christianity is true for Christians. We believe that it's actually true, that even if we chose not to believe it, it would still be true. If everyone chose to disbelieve it, it would be no different than everyone suddenly choosing to disbelieve gravity. You might want to say it, but when you jump off the roof, you're still going to hit the ground.
It's going to hit you.
And the same thing is true with Christianity. We can all believe that Jesus didn't rise from the dead. And the other thing I want to bring up, too, because we talked about the implications not just for us, but for people across the aisle or cross culture from us. But it's also not just people. I mean, the biblical story takes us from the creation of the heavens and earth to the new creation of the heavens and earth. I mean, this is a cosmic story. Certainly people are at the center of it, but there's a cosmic story of the renewal and reconciliation of all things. I mean, the first 3 chapters of Genesis, first really 11 chapters of Genesis, are reversed in the last 11 chapters of Revelation. You just kind of set them up side by side. And so you see that Christianity actually offers this grand meta-narrative of life in the world.
In regards to this, I failed to mention earlier that there's a chat feature on our webcast today. And so we've got viewers out there that are typing in questions for you, John, too. Joel, what do we have online?
Hi, John. We have a guest who says, defining terms is important to confirm we're all talking about the same thing. For example, what do people mean when they say love? Like John mentioned that. What do they mean by living out the gospel? And we need to get beyond the Christianese if we communicate with each other as Christians and then with the world. Yeah,
John, I know that when I've spoken with you before, we've even talked about parenting, and a big thing that you always do even around your dinner table is ask you, because what do you mean by that? What do you mean by that? And that's a real practical experience to what I think this on the chat that's come through is we need to define these terms.
Yeah.
And how does that play itself out in the real world?
No, that's exactly right. I mean, I think it was Confucius, who said that when words lose their meaning, people lose their lives. And I think Chesterton said, if words aren't worth fighting for, what on earth would be? Because words really do matter. The moment someone who was Jewish in Nazi Germany was defined as less than human, then they didn't have human rights. And love is an important example as well. Almost, let's talk about that. I think we often say to students, ideas have definitions, and so you want to keep that question, what do you mean by that, always in your pocket. I mean, we look at the current situation when it comes to, let's say specifically the LGBT issues and same-sex marriage, or really all things having to do with what my friend Jay Richards calls the pelvic issues, right? And, one of the things that C.S. Lewis wrote is he said, biblically love has 4 definitions, or there's 4 things that we kind of use love for. You get the kind of the sentimentality, and you get the brotherly love, and you've got the erotic love, and you've got the sacrificial love, right? But you go into our culture, and when somebody uses love, or when love is sung about in a song, or name your Nicholas Sparks novel, they're all the same thing, right? Love is only meant in a sentimental or a sexual way. So all loves have been kind of defined down to only these 2. And so why does that make a difference? Well, if our culture doesn't have really categories of strong brotherly love and sacrificial love, that's going to change the makeup of society. That's going to change how parents parent. It's going to change what it means to love our neighbors. So that's why I said we have these Facebook memes going around for the last 3 days. Love one, love one. Well, what do you mean by love? Because some loved one, some didn't.
Yeah.
Love for the future, love for future children, that didn't win in the Supreme Court decision. Erotic love won out, sentimental love, romantic love won out, but it certainly wasn't agape love that won out. And that's why definitions really matter. And let's go down the line. Freedom. Talk about a word that needs to be redefined, right? Truth. Right? That needs to be refined. The word tolerance, right? Tolerance used to mean you disagreed, but you tolerated. Now It means you don't disagree at all. Very different definition. The word, the human person, whether we're made in the image of God or whether we're primarily animals with a sexual instinct. I mean, these are very different definitions of what it means to be human.
Wow. Speaking of definitions, now we're going to get into some more hot topic issues a little bit later with Jeff. But I can't resist this because I just had a conversation with a guy at church last week, and in regards to the gay marriage decision. And he said, Jefferson, let it go. It's a word. Marriage is just a word. Let them have it. We'll come up with our own definition of what we do within the church, but it's just a word. And your voice was ringing in my head going, yeah, but words have meaning. What do we say in that context? What do we say in that debate of, hey, it's just a word. Don't make such a big deal about it.
Well, I mean, I think the church has called it a lot of things, holy matrimony and other things, but it refers to a reality. It refers to something that actually predates the church and predates the state. This is the thing about the marriage debate. I mean, there was a popular left-leaning, Christian blogger, celebrated the decision and so on, and she's like, I just don't understand why, Christians want to force their views on everybody else. But that's assuming that that's what was happening. It actually is not what was happening. There was a definition of marriage that predates the church. It predates Christianity. It predates the government. Neither the church nor the government define marriage. The responsibility of the church and the government, any more than they define gravity, right? Any more than we define, anything. Our job is to recognize it. And governments have been, quite good at not recognizing reality, like human dignity and so on. But that's when it's a sad day. Marriage is actually the way the world is. And to say that it doesn't matter is just not. I mean, if it didn't matter, then there wouldn't be any statistical data difference between cohabitation and marriage.
Right.
But my friend Glenn Stanley, Folks in the Family, has written a book called The Ring Makes All the Difference, in which he measures out all the social goods that marriage produces. Cohabitation doesn't produce those same goods. In fact, it produces, in many ways, the opposite.
Yeah.
To say that it doesn't matter is to basically say, well, it doesn't matter if our culture decides to deny reality. And isn't that really what's happening? Because what are we pretending? Two things that are observably true, but we're now denying in same-sex marriage, LGBT, transgender issues, and also, by the way, no-fault divorce and all the other fruits of the sexual revolution. We pretend two things that are observably true, but we're pretending they're not. Number one, that sex, marriage, and babies are connected, right? That's why, by the way, even in societies that tolerated homosexual behavior and even promoted it, it still didn't call it marriage, because sex, marriage, and babies are clearly together. Because sex makes babies, society is interested in babies because they want a future, and babies do better with a mom and a dad. That was a debate that was settled a long time ago. So these these three things that are observably true are now being denied. And the other thing that is observably true is that men and women are different. Now, of course, we can debate on what that means, but to say that they're not, or as Jenny Moore says, is one of the lies of the sexual revolution, is that men and women are interchangeable. And that's just obviously not true. But we're a culture now that's denying reality, and that's why we should care about these things.
And we're going to talk a lot more about those different issues in specific, and we'll just run down a laundry list after our interview with Jeff. John, thank you so much for kind of laying down the groundwork for what it means to have a Christian worldview. We're going to springboard off of that in the next part of our webcast, so hang on for me if you would, John. And viewer, thank you so much for your chat, for the different comments that are coming through. We're going to get to more of those as the interview goes on too. And after this little clip, we want to show you kind of what it looked like when our next guest was a boy. Jeff Allen's going to join me in just a second. And in the meantime, go ahead and enjoy some of Jeff's comedy.